Good afternoon. My name is Mary Papayya, and I'm the chair of Media Freedom at the South African National Editors Forum, SANEF. On behalf of SANEF, I welcome you all to the second webinar as part of the SANEF Ethics and Credibility webinar series. And it's lovely to see some friendly faces, new and old. These important platforms follow the all-important Independent Satchwell Commission of Inquiry into Media Ethics and Credibility as commissioned by SANEF. The webinar is part of a four-part series. It is a precursor to the all-important SANEF Media Ethics Conference to be held next month. Each webinar, including today, will define key recommendations to put forward during the National Online Conference next month in May. Please note that this webinar is being recorded. A live tweet will be made available on the SANEF Twitter page for the duration of our discussion. The hashtag Ethical Journalism SA. Thanks to everybody joining us, our incredible panelists, thought leaders in the field, and those from industry, as well as all interest groups who join us. Our topic for today, considering ethics as a tool for change. In continuing our investigation and picking up on what happened post the Commission of Inquiry into Quality and Ethical Journalism, we considered this from the twin perspective of themes. The first theme being strengthening the ethics codes and principles, and the second, strengthening the regulators. Now we share with you some of the key recommendations that came out of the Satchwell Commission of Inquiry. And here we will go through it very briefly, and it is something that our speakers will touch on. In the first aspect, we look at the ethics and standards. It talks about promoting journalistic and media principles. I'm not going to go through all of it, but some of it just to make you think about our discussion that comes out of today. It talks about policy and the disclosure of income for journalists. It looks at encouraging ongoing conversation and debate into current and new codes of ethics. It also talks about collaboration, and then lastly, it looks at discussions with journalists navigating multiple roles. To continue on the theme ethics and standards, we look at combining the constitutional right of journalists to hold opinion. It looks at public trust, an important issue that has come up in discussion all over the country of late. It talks about drawing up an ethical reporting checklist for stories nominated for awards. And then it looks at tensions between the right of reply principle and hearing from outlier opinions contrary to verified facts. And it goes on to end with news entities to introduce an editorial advisory board to implement standard practice for editorial policies. Now, this particular slide, the first of two, deals with the regulatory body. It talks about a more active role in quality control of news. And I think this is an important aspect of our discussion. Obviously, talking to sustainability, it looks at additional financial resources that current regulatory bodies need to look at, ensuring complaints mechanisms are accessible, and it ends with the expanding of capacity of regulatory bodies. The last second screen on the regulatory body looks at establishing an anonymous hotline for complaints about the media. And I think that would make for some very interesting discussion. It says, make information about said complaints accessible in all South African languages. And SANEF should continue collaboration with the regulatory bodies. SANEF should engage with the media industry to create a portal between media co-regulatory bodies, and SANEF should give full support to media regulatory bodies, ending with the recommendation that SANEF should account to the regulatory body to which they subscribe. Thank you very much. I think that sets the scene for some of the important aspects that we can look at. Now, the session today is made up of two sessions. We will have inputs from our most credible and wonderful panelists, individuals who come highly recommended with great experience. And the second part will be a break. Can I ask whoever's not in speaking to please switch off their mics? Thank you very much. To reiterate, we will hear from our speakers in the first session, and then we'll go into a breakaway session to discuss the two themes. We have three speakers for this discussion, and our first speaker gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Franz Kruger. He's the adjunct professor and head of journalism at the journalism department at Wits University. Franz has worked in professional journalism for many decades. Included in his decades of contribution and service to journalism, we know that he worked in the anti-apartheid alternative media, and he was a senior member of the first post-apartheid editorial management team at the SABC. With a PhD in journalism and ethics from Wits University, he is the author and co-author of 3 books, several book chapters, journal articles, and many other publications. He was the founding director of the Wits Radio Academy. He served as Ombud for the Mail and Guardian, and also served on the South African Press Appeals Panel. I want to now hand over to Franz Kruger. Franz, welcome.
And thanks for the opportunity to participate in this discussion. The report that we're discussing really is an extraordinarily thorough piece of work that covers a lot of ground, and I think it's been really a good thing for SANEF to break it up into different sections and have these discussions on particular themes. I mean, I was going back over some of the recommendations yesterday, just in thinking about today, and I mean, there are a couple of things that stand out for me in terms of the recommendations. If we're talking about the codes and the regulatory bodies, I mean, what I think is useful to highlight is that really much of what is being found here is that the codes themselves and the regulatory structures themselves really are working pretty well. I think that there have been criticisms directed in various directions, but certainly from this report, I think what emerges is quite a good report. Clearly, codes always need to be subject to review. And there are a couple of points that emerge in the report and that you've highlighted, and others that might want to talk about. I'm particularly interested in what the report says about transparency of journalists themselves. I think that is a kind of a relatively new idea that I think really is worth giving quite a lot of attention to. I think the extent to which we hold people to account, I think that our personal behavior, particularly around potential conflicts of interest, I think need to be held to a similar standard. But there are other things, and I mean, maybe in the discussion later on, one can go into those. The system of regulation seems to be working pretty well, according to the report, and I would certainly echo that. I think it's useful in this context to really focus quite sharply on where the problem may be with regard to the regulatory structures. And it is simply this. It is that there are a couple of media houses that are outside, and that really is a problem for credibility. And that the media, particularly the print media industry, is under so much financial pressure that there are not enough resources. And that's a significant issue that I think needs some discussion, because the credibility of the particularly the Press Council, the PCSA, I think is in a somewhat different position. Really rests on its effectiveness, and you can't be effective unless you have the people and the money to be so. I like the idea of a common portal. I mean, I think in the long run, one is going to have a system where, complaints against media content go into one house for to be dealt with. But I think to create a common portal, I think is a good step along that road. The one thing that I think that is very interesting, and that also I think bears a bit of discussion, is the extent to which individuals should sign up to the code. That is not something that we've had in the past. I mean, in the past, the principle has always been that it is the employer, the media house, that is answerable. But I think as the borders, so to speak, of professional journalism become more fuzzy, and as more people individually are actually active, as you know, in journalism, I think that is something that can be thought about. And I certainly think that what is interesting is the idea that both media houses and individuals could use their membership or their signing up or their support of the code as a kind of badge of credibility. I think that's an interesting idea that could be explored. And finally, there is one of the recommendations which is sort of somewhat tucked away, but which reminded me that actually it was a recommendation that we made some years back when the Press Council itself, and I was involved in that exercise, was looking at itself just before the Press Freedom Commission. And that is simply to be more proactive, to find, the issues that need to be dealt with, and to pick them up even before a complaint comes before the council. I mean, it's not uncontroversial, and it has to be thought through. The kind of means and the ways and wherefores need to be thought through. But I think there is considerable power in that idea. Of course, it's also tied up with resources. It needs people and time to do that kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, as a whole, I think there are some very useful recommendations there. And yeah, I look forward to the discussion. Thanks, Mary.
Thank you so much, Franz. We will tag onto the points of interest that you mentioned after all the speakers have had a chance to make their input. We now go on to a presentation by Aidan White. He is the founder of the Ethical Journalism Network, a campaign promoting self-regulation, good governance, and the ethical conduct in the media. I must say that Aidan could not join us in person today due to some emergency work. So he did send us, we do have a pre-recorded version of the input that he would have made. Aidan is also the former Secretary General of the International Federation of Journalists. He has worked for several newspapers in the United Kingdom, including The Guardian, and he is a long-time campaigner for journalists' rights and a former activist with the National Union of Journalists in Great Britain and Ireland.
In order to sort of just start on, how do we embed ethical principles and ethical values in our media and our journalism? Well, I think one of the first things we have to do is to identify one of the key themes of how we work and the way we work, and that is, in my view, transparency. We have to be open. We have to ensure that our audience and our readers know who we are and what we're doing. And that means from top to bottom. They need to know who the owners are. They need to know who the editors are. They need to know who the journalists are. And they need to be reassured that everyone involved in the process has an understanding of the public purpose of journalism and the need to be ethical. So how do you do that? Well, many media companies have editorial guidelines to help them identify what are the key ethical principles of journalism. I don't want to support in one particular code of conduct. There are hundreds of codes of conduct around the world, and one could choose anyone from off the shelf. But all of these codes of conduct tend to share 5 universal values. And it's important that in our journalism and whatever code we're using and the guidelines we're preparing reflect these values. The first value is accuracy and fact-based communication. We have to make sure that we are, when we are producing information, it's factually based, and we need to know that we have checked it out, and so that people can rely on the basis that it's factual. The second core value is the one of independence, political independence. Media have got to be careful that they are not perceived to be, or are not actually being, propagandists, either for governments or for any particular interest group or for advertisers and so on. So editorial independence is absolutely key. The third value is impartiality in the way that we work. That doesn't mean that we have to sort of have journalism which creates a false balance between different and unequal power groups, but we have to ensure that through our impartial processes, we look for the other side of the story. We look for the alternative voices that need to be heard in the production of our stories. So this question of impartiality is a journalistic process in seeking out other voices that need to be heard in the telling of stories. The fourth value, the fourth core value is what I believe is probably the most important one, in the sense that it deals with the responsibility of media and journalism to the people it serves, and that is the ethic of humanity. Journalism is not about promoting hate speech. It's not about seeking to expose vulnerable people, children, people who need support. We are not in the business of showing explicit scenes of violence or other disturbing images which may do harm to people. We always recognize the need not to do harm. Sometimes it can't be avoided, but what we do is we ask the question, is this satisfying our humanitarian principles and our humanitarian ethics? Do no harm is a key value. And the fifth value, a core value, which I think we all find a bit difficult, is the value of accountability. You know, we journalists are not very good at it, but we have to say sorry when we make mistakes. We have to provide remedy when we get things wrong. And we have to be open to our readers and engage with our readers. So these are the values which are absolutely critical in building an ethical culture in our media. Accuracy, independence, impartiality, humanity, and accountability are absolutely important. But how do we do that? Finally, I think the way that we do that is that we declare our mission, we declare our attachment to a code of conduct. And above all, we enforce editorial guidelines which help our journalists and managers and even the board of directors to understand that we don't engage in conflicts of interest, that we are very clear about our responsibility to be transparent in all of our affairs and to make sure that we are keeping to our principles. So guidelines are extremely important. We also have to make sure that we are regulating ourselves effectively. So we need to have internal systems of self-regulation that work well. Sometimes we may be members of a national or industry-wide council, media council or press council, and that's important also to declare the fact that we are prepared to make ourselves accountable to our peers. But internal self-regulation, internally examining what we do and how we do it, is an absolutely key part of creating that culture. So how do we start? These are the values, this is what we would like to do, but how do we start? One of the things that the Ethical Journalism Network suggests is that media should carry out their own internal ethical audits. They should make an assessment of how they work, how ethics are put into place, how we have forms of guidance for the way that journalists work, the way that editors work, the way that the board of directors work, the way that the publisher and the owners work as well. And these should be, as far as possible, made available to everyone. So an ethical audit is a good way of examining where we are now. How do we work? And one of the things that many media do, and I think it's very important, is they publish an annual report. And of course, all media companies will publish an annual report. It'll normally have financial information, talk about the circulation and what they're doing and so on. and they probably have to do it by law in order to continue trading. But that annual report should be an opportunity to showcase the values and the standards and the codes that a media organization is following. And an annual report is a good way of showing how well you're doing in satisfying these ethical principles. So, I mean, really, that's all I'd like to say. But of one thing I'm certain, and that is that a media organization today that fails to take account of its need and responsibility to be ethical and transparent in the way that it works will not survive. Today, we journalists and media face all sorts of pressures and problems, pressures from commercial interest, pressures from within the community, and above all, often dangerously, pressure from political institutions and, of course, from government. But we also have to make sure that our staff are protected from physical attack and the potential for physical attack. So I think there is a need to ensure that we have an ethical approach to all aspects of journalistic work, including an ethical approach to reporting from potentially dangerous zones. And we also have to have an ethical way of working on stories which sometimes could put journalists at risk. Very often, investigative journalism will take us into places where we will be touching information that powerful groups, sometimes they will be civil groups, the criminal groups, powerful interest groups, sometimes governments, sometimes political interests will not want that information to be published. And it'll be very important for us internally to have ways of assessing the risks that journalists are facing. So I think it's always ethically important that when we're talking about the safety and the security of our staff, to ensure that we have an ethical checklist that allows us to make a risk assessment of stories and how they're to be told. And we make sure that our people are not putting themselves unnecessarily at risk. I've always believed that no story is worth the single life of a journalist. And therefore, we have to make sure that our duty of care as media owners and editors and journalists who want to look after their colleagues is to make sure that our people are protected. And we can best do that by putting in place an ethical checklist to make sure we're carrying out proper risk assessment. If we are ethical, if we are very clear about what we're doing, then I think media can look forward and journalism can look forward to a future. It's difficult these days to find methods of sustainability, and I know that everyone is concerned about finding the resources and the money to keep going. That's very important, but believe me, unless we're honest and truthful in the way that we organize ourselves as journalists, we're never going to survive. And I wish you all well, because I know that you're working in areas where all of these problems arise, but I think you're also working in areas where trusted, honest, ethical journalism has a great future. Thank you very much indeed.
Yeah, that was Aidan White from the Ethical Journalism Network. We now move on to our next speaker, and I want to welcome Sisanda Nkoala, an academic from the Cape Peninsula University of Technology's Media Department. Sisanda's research interests are in the rhetoric and language of journalism and journalism education, and she lectures in media law. She is an award-winning journalist herself and serves on the South African Press Council as a public representative. Welcome, Sisanda.
Thank you very much, Mary, for that welcome. Can somebody please share my screen? So today I'm going to be speaking specifically around the Press Council's response to the recommendations in the report, focusing on specific sections of the report that spoke directly to us as the Press Council. In particular, chapters 5, which looked at media ethics and standards of practice in the media industry. Chapter 11, which looked at media complaints, public opinions, systems and rulings. And then chapter 12, which looked at regulation of media in South Africa. The specific areas of discussion on media ethics and regulation that we would like to propose to be considered at the upcoming conference relate to the unitary code, the unitary complaints procedure, the voluntary nature of the public use of regulatory bodies, individual membership, the issue of sanctions, the sustainability of regulatory bodies, as well as the issuing of annual reports on media ethics. And I'm grateful that Franz and the previous speaker went before me because they've laid a foundation to these. So you can move on to the next slide, beginning first with the idea of the unitary code. You can move on from that slide to the next one. So the report made mention of encouraging industry co-regulatory bodies to consider a converged code of ethics. And this is an idea that the Press Council endorsed last year in the form of a concept document. The concept document was circulated to industry bodies for consideration, and it emanated from a similar document that was drafted by the Namibian media industry. So we thought to draft one in our own context using the PCSA and the Press Council as a foundation. So the issue of convergence has raised a need to consider moving away from platform-based complaint systems to content-based system, which Franz alluded to earlier. So this, I think, going into the conference, we are proposing that the conference endorse this concept of a unitary code for further consultation and development. We can move on to the next slide. Bleeding on from this is the idea of a unitary complaints procedure. And in this respect, the report mentioned investigating, establishing this procedure where there's a single portal or process between the media regulatory bodies. And this is something that the Press Council supports, a one-stop complaints platform. It can be as simple as an email address that reaches the different regulatory bodies. It needn't be the establishment of a completely new office or a new entity. So our proposal going into the conference is to endorse the concept of a unitary complaints procedure system also for further development and consultation. The next slide, please. Then the report made mention of the voluntary nature of the public use of regulatory bodies. And in this respect, it was critiquing the fact that because the public can elect to use regulatory bodies or elect to complain to regulatory bodies, it has resulted in wild and untested allegations, particularly on social media. And in this respect, the Press Council has a provision for the public advocate to actually proactively initiate complaints on a regular basis, not just on exceptional instances, but on an ongoing and regular basis, so that we are seen to be proactive on matters and not waiting to receive complaints from members of the public. Moving to the next slide. The issue of individual membership, which was also mentioned by Franz. Here, we don't agree with the report, which says individual rather than media house subscription. Rather, we say that currently the Press Code does make provisions for people to join in their individual capacity. There is still scope, and we still recommend that it be through media houses where journalists are employed in those media entities. But as was mentioned earlier, the industry has changed, and you have bloggers, you have social media owning brands that are not affiliated to a media entity. So they need some kind of mechanism to align themselves to regulatory bodies. So having that individual membership, which is already in place at the in the Press Council, would respond to this. So proposing for the conference is to note that media individual membership is already possible. The next slide, thank you. The report made mention of consideration of sanctions in the form of fines or suspensions from media organizations for journalists who commit ethical breaches. And in this respect, we've taken note of this, and it's something we are going to consider further, bearing in mind that there are differences in how the PCSA and the Press Council respond to or mete out sanctions for contraventions. So this would be an issue to be considered along the lines of consideration to the Unitary Code. Next slide. Then the second to last point relates to the sustainability of regulatory bodies. And in this respect, the report recommended additional financial and personal resources so that the secretariats of regulatory bodies can coordinate with all media bodies. And this is something the Press Council strongly supports. It's been mentioned, you know, the demise of print media in particular, with the implications of COVID and the closing of certain media forms, magazines, to cite an example, have demonstrated a need for greater resources to be invested in entities like the Press Council, because while we have funding from media entities, it is only sufficient to sustain the basic tasks that we do. And if we want to take some of the recommendations made in this report further, really there is scope to consider having the Media Sustainability Fund apportion some of its fund to regulatory bodies so that they can execute their initiatives better. There's also a need for corporate South Africa to consider how the role of the media as a fourth estate is important to democracy and to their functioning, and to perhaps consider how it can come to the party to ensure the continued existence of voluntary media regulation. And then the final point that we'd like to discuss in the last slide relates to this, and that was the reference in the report to the issuing of annual reports on media ethics. So here the call was for ongoing research to aspects such as the nature of complaints that regulatory bodies receive, their findings, recommendations, and trends. And this is something we support, but because of extremely limited financial needs or financial resources, it is something that would be very difficult to implement on our part. So going into the conference, it's consideration as to how a media sustainability fund can be used to fund regulatory bodies so that they can undertake this task, which the report recommended as being important. So those are the aspects that we have thought through and highlighted ahead of the conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sisanda. Just to recap very briefly, Franz mentioned to us that in South Africa, we're doing pretty well when it comes to the self-regulation mechanism. But he pointed out the issue of the problem lies in the industry when some are inside the lines of self-regulation and others in the media industry are not. So something that we need to look at. But what was important from Franz's input is that self-regulation, and certainly the codes that pertain to media and ethics and conduct, is that we see it as a badge of reward. And that's something I think that's that we see across the board. And Franz also spoke about the issue of transparency, which leads me to what Aidan was saying. Aidan spoke about transparency, and then he linked it to 5 key values. He spoke about independence, impartiality, and when it came to the ethics of humanity, he gave us some examples there. He also touched on the accountability aspect. He spoke about both internal codes of conduct, and then gave us some example of how we could start that in our own news environments. And moving on to what Sisanda said, she made mention of the unitary code that the Press Council wants us to look at. And I think that's important. How would that fit into where we're at the moment? And she looked at procedures and implementation from that perspective, a one-stop complaint support system. She also looked at the issue of individual membership, the use of bodies, such as the Press Council, the issue of sanctions, and then she touched on something that I think we should be talking about quite vigorously, and that is the sustainability of self-regulatory bodies, as well as leaning on into where the media itself finds itself at the moment when it comes to the post-COVID scenario. So on that point, I want to now get back to the discussion at hand. We are joined by several individuals. I know that we've got the Media 24 Ombud here with us today, George Claassen. I see we've got Anton Harbour, who's also here. We've got someone from the PCSA, if I'm not mistaken. But before we move on to that, let's get a quick input from Franz on response to the issue of the unitary code.
Thanks very much. I think the idea of having a single code across the platforms is a very good one. And interestingly enough, I mean, if you look at the PCSA code, it is in fact taken largely from the press code of some years ago. It is just that there are some adjustments and changes that have been made over time that they didn't capture. So in a sense, you know, particularly when it comes to journalism, there is a lot of room, I think, for a shared approach, and I think historically we've had perhaps a closer alignment than we have currently. Of course, there are some differences. I mean, there are some issues that arise in broadcasting that are less prominent in print and vice versa. But in general, I think, you know, if a unitary code can be drafted, I think it's a very good thing.
Thank you, Franz. Sisanda, I'd like your input here on the value systems that Aidan raised. And one of the key issues he spoke about was the independence aspect. What's your thought about what Franz raised about the complexity that South Africa finds itself in that we have some who belong and others who don't? What is the long-term prognosis of such a situation in South Africa, and what would it mean for journalism?
I think, Mary, it's important that membership be voluntary, because that is what strengthens adherence. If we make it compulsory, then people would have a reason not to necessarily adhere to the standards set. So it does pose a challenge. And I think it's in winning over, firstly, the public to understand the role of regulatory bodies such that they choose content aligned with regulatory bodies. So if a news entity does not subscribe to an entity like the Press Council or the PCSA, in the mind of the public, raising the questionability of the ethical practices in that entity, and in a way prompting the public not to prefer those kinds of publications or entities. So if we can elevate and demonstrate the importance of regulatory bodies to the public, so they choose content aligned to those, that would be a way of compelling those that do not see value within the media industry of being aligned to regulatory bodies like the Press Council to see that value and then come on board. I think that's the only way, but trying to make it mandatory or enforce it would defeat the purpose.
Thank you so much. One of the things that came up in the recommendations pointed to the public trust in media and the importance thereof. Professor Anton Harber, you with us, perhaps share with us some of your thoughts on the issue of the public trust and where we're at the moment.
Look, since you're calling on me to speak unexpectedly, I do want to say that I think our strongest pressing issue is the fact that we have rogue media houses that are not members, that break all the rules, that discredit us all, that weaken us all, and that make our lives much more difficult. I think we have to address what we do to bring back into the fold those who have broken with us. I really do think that we can have whatever rules we like, but if there's large media houses that are defying and breaking out and not part of our community and our attempts to fix this, then we're very troubled. We have to address that first and foremost.
Thank you, Anton. Certainly points to the issue of trust, because the public is none the wiser when it comes to the issue of regulation if we don't ourselves do it. I've been asked, I'm looking at the chat box here, and it says, Mahmoud Sangli raises the issue of advocate journalism. And he says, are there any specific or more focused guidelines in this respect for publications that do advocacy journalism, example, a mission to support social justice? And Terry Bell, whom we all know and who serves also in the Media Freedom Subcommittee of SANEF, says surely social justice should be part and parcel of ethical journalism. We serve not sectional interests, but the interests of humanity as a whole. And that is something that Aidan pointed to. He spoke about the issue of humanitarian journalism. We're not here to cause harm. Perhaps, Franz, some input from your side on that aspect.
Well, the question of advocacy journalism is an important one. We say on the one hand that journalism is about giving people facts and that's all. But at the same time, I mean, there are really powerful and outstanding traditions of journalism that really took very strong views. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I think, when Mahmoud is asking for specific guidelines, I mean, one would have to look and see whether there is a more extensive kind of expression of this. But I think that where, the press code itself says that the media are entitled to hold views and to express those. I think where those views are honestly held and where they are based in kind of factual, on a factual base, they really do have their place and are often really admirable. I mean, Terry's point about social justice journalism, I suppose the distinction here is about journalism which serves broader social justice, which is, I think, what he's saying, which I agree, that is what journalism should be about, and a more partisan approach which takes an attitude, to a particular issue. I mean, the best example that we've had, I think, in this country has been around the campaigning around HIV and AIDS, where most media took a very firm view that really what the government of the time was doing was completely out of order and in fact harmful. And I think, the media played an honorable role, the journalism played an honorable role in pushing back a particularly ruinous and ill-considered policy direction.
Thank you, Franz. So certainly that would lead us into what was also raised, and I think all three speakers did touch on it, and that is looking at internal controls and how that would sort of flow nicely into the external controls when it comes to the Press Council and then the Broadcasting Complaints Commission itself, and the whole purpose of self-regulatory mechanisms. Sisanda, perhaps your view on where are we at in terms of internal controls and internal editorial policies in the media industry as a whole?
So I am in the ivory tower of the academy, so I cannot speak authoritatively on where we are, but I would align myself with the proposition made on at the session on Wednesday around having things like the press code and PCSA code of conduct as part of employment contracts for journalists that work with media entities that are members of these regulatory bodies. So it's part and parcel of what the journalist knows is expected of them and is not something they are not familiar with. But the extent to which it's currently happening in newsrooms, I can't speak definitively, unfortunately, on that, Mary.
Thank you very much. In terms of the individuals and participants who are here, do we have George Claassen with us? And do we have the director of the Press Council South Africa? George, can you please join us on chat on live and give us some feedback on your thoughts on what was mentioned by the various speakers today, and how the internal structures of newsrooms are working from your perspective?
Yes, can you hear me?
We can, George, go ahead.
Mary, the important thing is I just put it on the message box, is that Aidan White emphasized the question of accountability very strongly. And I think Anton Harber's reference to the rogue people outside the ombuds process, the ethics process, also emphasized that the point I'm trying to make is that in the Satchwell report, there's a very strong emphasis on internal ombud systems being instituted or established inside media houses. I think that isn't getting enough attention because that is the first step of any media organization to show their accountability, that they listen to their readers or viewers, and that they react to complaints directly. Many of the complaints I, for example, receive can be dealt with internally before it had or has to reach the press council as such, the press ombud. So I think news organizations are too hesitant to institute internal ombud. It's an international process that is very strongly growing. I'm sitting on the board of the Organization of International News Ombud and Standards Editors, and this is growing very strongly. Overseas in other countries all over the world, that they are appointing internal ombud. 2 years ago, when we had the conference in New York, 5 new members signed up. Even the New York Times came back and CNN signed up. They were never part of ONO or internal ombud system. So that is very heartwarming that is starting to happen. But accountability, we have to be seen that we are serious at the lowest level, and the lowest level is the level where our individual media houses show that they are accountable. Thank you.
Thank you so much, George. I think before we wrap up the session to go into the 2 groups of discussion, Franz and Sisanda, very quickly here. So George points to an internal ombudsman. What I want to ask you, and I think the questions that come to mind is, how effective then does that make the external self-regulation press ombudsman system? Would we find that increasingly we'll be using our own internal mechanisms to resolve it? And perhaps some guidance on that and how the 2 would work in parallel structure. And then the second aspect I'd like input from you, especially Franz, is on the issue of sanctions, which came up in the Satchwell Commission recommendation. Perhaps some guidance there on how we can implement that going forward. We'll start with Sisanda and then go to Franz. Thanks.
So I think the internal system, as George mentioned, is a starting point, but it does raise questions, as I think Dinesh put in the chat, that depending on what, or the efficacy of, or the perceived efficacy of it, it can seem like it's not really effective, as is in the comment that is made around Indie's internal system. So I think there's scope for both, because the external system is about the industry broadly, and the internal system would look at an individual media entity. So there's scope for both, but we cannot do away with the bodies that oversee particular sectors of the media overall.
To point, before Franz comes in there, Terrier says that the internal system is not an alternative to the wider voluntary regulatory system. It should be complementary, as in a lower court to a higher court. I think that sums it up quite beautifully. Go ahead, Franz.
So I would agree that there is room for internal systems of accountability in addition to an industry-wide one. I think the points that have been made are perfectly valid. And just to add one other consideration, and that is that I think we benefit if there are more points of contact for the public to lodge their complaints rather than less. So if there is an internal mechanism in addition to the industry-wide one, it's all to the good, because it's just an extra door on which people can knock. I mean, I was ombudsman for the Mail and Guardian for something like 8 years. And, you know, I had very good relationships with the Press Council at the time, and in fact served in the appeals panel as well. And there really wasn't any kind of question of it being an either or an alternative or an attempt to usurp anybody's function. It's just an extra mechanism. I mean, Dinesh makes an important point. I mean, I think the response to that is that the credibility of something like the independence system is affected, let me say, by the reputation of the group as a whole, and particularly by its proprietor. I don't think it's the fact that it's an internal system that is a problem, it's whose internal system it is. I mean, I think the reputation of George's office, for instance, is very high, because you know, he's thoughtful, he has a long track record, and you know, he considers things quite carefully, and they are listened to by the group that he's working for. So I think, you know, it depends on where you are, as much as what kind of a mechanism you represent. You ask about sanctions. Now, I think the current system of sanctions is fine at the Press Council. I mean, I suppose there's room to discuss kind of tightening it up. I don't think individual sanctions are appropriate in the context of particularly the printed media, partly simply because what you see at the end of the day is the result of many hands that have been on that product. And to single out the person who's got the byline is not always, it is sometimes somewhat unfair. I think that, as the Satchwell report says, the media listen to these rulings. And, you know, I think that there is sometimes in the wider discussion a temptation to say, well, there are problems, therefore we must be harsher. And actually, it doesn't really follow. You know, the fact that people get sentenced to long jail terms for corruption and other terrible crimes doesn't, unfortunately, put an immediate stop to them. It's a much wider problem. So I think the regime of sanctions at the moment is broadly fine. I think, you know, what is instructive also is that little window that there is for fining outlets for, I think the term is recidivism that is used, you know, is about as, it hasn't actually been used to my knowledge. So, you know, I'm not sure that tougher sanctions are going to assist us.
Thank you so much, Franz. We've come to this to the point in the discussion where we'd love to go on, but clearly we have to move into our separate discussive groups. So for purpose of clarity, just to let you know that the two themes we're discussing is 1, strengthening ethic codes and principles, and 2, strengthening the regulators. As we move into our breakaway rooms, one will be chaired by Franz from SANEF, and the other one will be chaired by another SANEF member, Isak Minar. So welcome back, frayintermedia, thanks for that. I'm gonna go straight to the first discussion group and call on Amina Frenzy to take us through the first theme, strengthening ethics, codes and principles. Thank you, Amina.
Thank you very much, Mary. I think we are agreed on quite a few issues that were discussed in the plenary session. I'll start with the encouraging of the internal ombud structure that has been emphasized again, how important it is to attend to grievances or complaints or whatever speedily, and not to cause any holdup in possibly attending to breaches. And this process obviously is not an either-or situation as far as the South African press ombuds system is concerned, but it's a complementary process. So I think there's widespread support for that. One of our participants wanted to know if there is a record of who has internal ombuds and what are the issues that they're dealing with there. Maybe we can think about that. Bearing in mind that previously it was said with the retrenchment processes going on, internal ombuds positions is probably the first to go. So I'm not sure how many internal ombuds there are. We spoke about one of the recommendations is for SANEF to establish a policy on disclosure of income for journalists. This was widely discussed, and what is intended with that. Are journalists, I raised, public service, and should there be public accountability of their income? But further discussion revealed that perhaps a disclosure is signed by journalists when they join an organization with possible conflict of interest. Maybe this should be done quarterly or annually. Some examples were raised that it is common practice at some media organizations. But also there was caution that if journalists were to disclose their incomes, it would just open them up, be more vulnerable to detractors, whoever is out there. About the need for an ethics chair to be established was raised and discussed. And it was felt that ethics is an integral part of journalism. There should be no need for the establishment of an ethical chair. On the question of the constitutional right of journalists to express their opinion, quite rightly, this does not include the daily columnists and analysts and op-eds, but it was discussed. It's important, it was felt, that journalists do express their opinion where relevant, and one has to be careful, one of the participants said, not to over bureaucratize this aspect and this point. I think I'm not sure if I missed out on anything. Whoever was in the group, if you want to add something that I had missed out. We talked about practical ways forward. How can we embed ethical behavior in journalists as such? What was also raised is, as far as the individual membership of a press council is concerned, what are the practicalities there? Because a complaint sometimes deals with the structural processes in reporting, and this demands the responsibility of an organization and not necessarily an individual. I think this was said regarding individual membership of the press council, which is now open, as we know. I think I've covered everything. Is there anything that I've missed out? I'm so sorry. If anyone wants to add.
Thank you, Amina, for those very important points and discussions, certainly robust indeed. Our second breakaway group was chaired by Isak Mina, and it spoke to strengthening the regulators, and the report back will be done by Helene Elof. Helene, thank you so much.
Sorry, I didn't unmute myself. Hello, everyone, I am here. Yeah, we agreed on most issues, especially the fact that we need to accommodate the current reality, being that we are all multimedia journalists, and radio and TV stations use text blogs, print journalists use podcasts, and we need a code that speaks to various platforms, kind of a all-in-one. And the media, all of us deal with the facts and reporting of facts. That is essentially our core duty, and we need to adhere to the same basic rules. It will be more time effective, it was said, and efficient to have one code that deals with all similar issues, and a single code gives certainty. If we have one scenario with two different outcomes as per two different codes, our self-regulation becomes inconsistent. A single code, we believe, will give certainty and clarity. It was also said that when considering this, it should be about what is best and the easiest for the public, because they are who we serve. And it will be simpler if we serve them with one set of rules and one complaint portal. We had some practical suggestions, which included that news companies should actually incorporate the code, for example, the press code adherence into their employment contract. And then there were some practical questions which will need to be looked at, such as how a unitary body will be funded and how prospective members will be vetted. And then one comment that will have to be discussed at some point is currently the domain name authorities can enforce takedown notices, and that affects us daily. So we'll need to pull in some institutions into that conversation when the time comes. If I missed anything, please just add to what I've said.
Thank you so much, Helene. I'm told it's Helene Viljoen, and Elof is the knee.
Oh, that's new. So don't worry about that.
Well, congratulations then. Thank you. So we've come to the end of what has been an extraordinarily robust discussion on something that's very important for our industry at the moment. And in closing, I want to say thanks to our panelists, Franz Kruger, Aidan White, and Sisanda Nkwala. Thanks to the chairs of the two groups, Amina Franz and also Isak Mina, and then Helene Viljoen, who gave the report back. I want to also thank all the participants, everybody who gave input in the chat, and in the groups themselves. And thanks to the team at frayintermedia who helped put all of this together and see us through this.